Good morning. Technology and I are not having a good day. We'll see if we can get this thing to fire up here, but I don't know what it's doing. It's just giving me a black screen is all it's doing. We are in the book of Exodus. We've been studying through the book of Exodus, and we are in chapter 16 of the book of Exodus. It's weird. I had it turned on last night before I put it in the backpack. I don't think so. No, I think that's fine. We are in Exodus chapter 16, and we've been looking through the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt, and the plagues have come upon Egypt, and they've been allowed to leave, and they've come through part of the wilderness. They were thinking that they were stranded, being up against the Red Sea, and that there was no way out, and Pharaoh and his army and his chariots were all going to come down upon them. And they were very concerned about that, but God had a plan. God was the one who had brought them out of Egypt in the first place. It wasn't by their own horsepower that they got to be where it is that they were, and so they got across the Red Sea, and then they were complaining about water because they had come to a place where the water was bitter. So God told Moses to cut a tree and to throw the tree into the water, and that would make the water able for them to be able to drink. And so they named the place Mara. And do you remember what Mara means? It means bitter, right? Over in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 20, Naomi, after she has lost her husband and lost both of her sons, she says, "No longer call me Naomi, but call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt with me very bitterly." And so Mara meant bitter. And so a lot of times they would do that. They would name the places based on what had happened there. There was a battle that took place where there was a 12-on-12 fight, and all 24 men fell down dead, being stabbed with swords. And so they named the place the Field of Sharp Swords. They named it Helkath Hazarim, if you want to practice your Hebrew for later. But they name places based on what happened there, and so they did the same thing here. And so now they've come to where they're wondering, okay, what is it that we're going to eat? And they're concerned that Moses has just brought them out in the wilderness to starve them, right? And we're going to see that over and over and over again if you follow the journeying of the children of Israel through the wilderness, even during the 40 years, even when you get into Leviticus and Numbers. They're going to continue to complain over and over and over again. And it's going to be a similar complaint. They're going to say, "Moses, did you bring us out here to kill us with thirst? Moses, did you bring us out here to kill us with hunger? Moses, did you bring us out here so that the Egyptian army could..." Weren't there graves back in Egypt? Right? They're going to constantly complain about the same thing. And so they're complaining about food. And so God tells Moses, "I'm going to provide food for them. And here's going to be the rules for that." And we started to look at that last week, or we looked at maybe most of this last week. But in Exodus chapter 16, it says, this is the thing in verse 16. "This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's need. 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent." By omers, he who had gathered much had nothing left over. He who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. And Moses said, "Let no one leave any of it until morning." Now, he says, you've gathered up what you need for today, and you would think that, okay, I'm hungry. I don't know what we're going to eat. There's this bread that's come down from heaven. I'm going to have that. I want to make sure I've got enough, right? We would maybe think in those terms. I want to make sure I've got enough to last me for maybe a couple of days. So I'm going to maybe hoard some of this. Moses says, don't do it. He says, don't keep any of it until evening. It says, nevertheless, right? In verse 20, "Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. Some of them left part of it until morning. It bred worms and it stank, and Moses was angry with them." They're not following the commands of the Lord. God's using all of these moments to test Israel, to see whether or not they're going to follow him, to see whether or not they're going to obey his commands, whether or not they're going to obey his statutes. And God told Moses that up front, that this is why I'm doing all of these things. Doing this as a test to see if Israel's going to follow me. And so they didn't listen. They didn't listen to the instructions. They didn't follow the instructions. They kept some of it over till morning. Well, it wasn't any good. It bred worms and it stank. And you can imagine if you've ever tried to remove gnats, right, from your house in the springtime, how hard that is to get rid of them. My wife, sometimes she'll put out a little dish that's got apple cider vinegar in it and some dish soap, right? And that usually works pretty effectively to kill them. But if you get a bunch of gnats in your house, sometimes it's hard. It takes a while to get rid of those suckers. They don't die very easy, and they evade you as you try to swat them, right? And so they had this problem, right? So because they didn't listen. And so Moses was angry with them. So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need, and when the sun became hot, it melted. So it was on the sixth day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, boil what you will boil, lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." So on the sixth day, they were allowed to gather twice as much as what they needed. Now, it's not going to stink. It's not going to breed worms. It's not going to go bad. They're going to be able to keep that bread that they gathered on the sixth day. They're going to be able to keep that for 2 days because he says the seventh day is going to be a Sabbath rest. Now, we haven't gotten to Mount Sinai yet, right? We haven't gotten to the giving of the 10 Commandments yet. What's one of the 10 Commandments? Keep the Sabbath day, right? It looks like he's already instituting some things with regards to a Sabbath rest on that seventh day, but sometimes we think that things are brand new with the Mosaic Law and things are brand new with the 10 Commandments. Some of the things seem to be in place already, and what God's doing is maybe codifying those things through the Mosaic Law, that now this is an official law, that this is written down in stone, if you will, that this is what it is that you're going to do. But this Sabbath rest, he's already putting into place here, that they don't gather anything on the seventh day. It says they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Moses said, "Eat that, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none." Now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" You see, this was a test too, to see, okay, you've gathered twice as much as what you need on the sixth day. You have what you need for the seventh day. Why would you go out there and look? I'm going to look for. If you're looking for the next day, if you're looking for day 8, right, it's not going to keep, right? The only stuff that's going to keep overnight is what you gather on the sixth day. And again, it's a test by God to see whether or not. And so God says, how long are these people going to do this? How long are they not going to obey me? How long are they not going to listen? It's a test. It's a simple test, but it's a test to see whether or not they're going to be faithful. Do you think God does that with us today? Do you think he tests us to see if we're going to follow what he says to do? What might one of those tests be? Meet with him on the first day of the week? Yeah, maybe that's a test, right? See if we're going to do what he says to do. What about baptism? A lot of folks in the world say, "Oh, you don't really need to be baptized." We say, "Why do you have to be baptized?" Because God said so. Do you think maybe he set that up as a test to see whether or not we're going to do? Remember when Naaman was told that he had to go dip in the Jordan River 7 times? And he says, "Well, why do I have to go dip in the..." Or it wasn't Naaman, it was Naaman who told him, right? Am I getting my names wrong? You know who I'm talking about. It was in the Old Testament, right? It was a leader of one of the Gentile nations, and he was told by prophet of God, it was Naaman, that he had to go dip in the Jordan River 7 times. And he says, "Well, can't I go dip in the river back home? It's much nicer than the Jordan. Why should I..." And the prophet says, "Well, why don't you just do what he says? Why don't you just simply do what the Lord says?" And he did what the Lord said, and his leprosy was healed on that occasion, right? And so sometimes maybe God tests us with these things to see whether we're going to be obedient. So some of the people went on the seventh day to gather, and they didn't find anything. And so Moses said, God says, "How long are they going to not keep my commandments? The Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives it to you on the sixth day, bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. So you've got this seventh day rest. And the Jews are supposed to keep that Sabbath day, right? Because that's going to be something that's going to be in the 10 Commandment law that they're supposed to keep. Now, the Pharisees, they went overboard, right, with Sabbath day requirements. They took what the law said that you couldn't do on the Sabbath day, and then they added a whole bunch of other things to that. And later on, they're going to accuse Jesus and his disciples of violating the Sabbath day because they're picking grain in order to eat, right? But they're violating the traditions of the elders. They're violating the traditions of the Pharisees there. They're not in violation of the law on that occasion. So the people were to rest on the seventh day. It says, the house of Israel called its name manna, and it was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. They called it manna. Do you remember when they first saw it laying on the ground? What did they say? What is it? And so manna is what? Manna is what? It's not a question. It's a statement, right? The word manna means what is it, right? And so they named it what is it, because they didn't know what it was, right? Now it's bread from heaven. It gives us a description of what it was like to try to describe it to us, but literally they called it what? Right, or what is it? And so when I say manna is what, it's kind of like who's on first. It's not a question, right? It's a statement that manna is what. That's what the word manna means, and that's what they named it. Now they're going to eat manna for 40 years. Right? God's going to provide for them their daily bread every day for 40 years. And Jesus, when he taught his disciples to pray, he prayed, right, to give us this day our daily bread. And they understood that in this time because you'd have to work. Sometimes you were what we would consider a day laborer, right? You'd have to work, you'd get paid at the end of the day, and you'd have to go buy your daily food. And so you would pray to God to provide that daily food to you. If whoever employed you cheated you and didn't pay you, you didn't eat that day. Right? And I think we don't understand that because we've got pantries, right? We got cabinets we put food, we got canned food that we got refrigerators, right? And so we don't think in terms of our daily food because we basically know if you're on vacation, maybe you don't know maybe exactly what you're going to have for lunch, but you probably have a pretty good idea of where you're going when you leave here this morning. But if you were going home, you'd have a pretty good idea of what's in the refrigerator and what you're planning to have for lunch today, right? Because it's already there. We don't have to go out and get our daily food. And so in verse 32, Moses said, "This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Fill an omer with it, to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread in which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." Moses said to Aaron, "Take a pot, put an omer of manna in it, and lay it up before the Lord to be kept for your generations." And so basically they take what would be a day's amount of this manna, right, a day's amount of this bread, and they were going to put it in a pot, and Aaron is going to keep that in order to be able to show future generations, here's what God fed you with in the wilderness. And I would imagine that didn't breed worms and that didn't stink, that kept in that pot. The book of Hebrews tells us that pot was kept in the ark of once they build the Ark of the Covenant. They haven't built that yet. But once they build the Ark of the Covenant, that's one of the things, along with the tablets of the Ten Commandments and along with Aaron's rod that had budded, those are the things that are going to be put in the chest. They're going to be put in the Ark of the Covenant. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron laid it up before the testimony to be kept, right? And so he's putting it with what? He's putting it with the testimony, right? That's what God is telling Moses to write, and Moses is writing these things down. And so that's a special place, right? You just don't put anything there with God's word. You just don't put anything there once the Ark of the Covenant is built. That's going to be in a special place. You don't just put anything in there. You just don't put any book in there either. And so it's to be kept with the testimony. And the children of Israel ate manna for 40 years. Until they came to an inhabited land, they ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. I don't know what 1/10 of an ephah is, but an omer in more modern terms is a gallon. We don't measure bread by the gallon. We usually measure it by the loaf, but how much bread you could fit, I guess, in a gallon container is what an omer came to be. It may have been something different in the ancient world, but that was the earliest description of what an omer is that it would be about a gallon. Any comments or questions through chapter 16?
I think it's noteworthy that, yes, God was testing them, but he was also very specific. And I think we need to learn from that God can be very specific. He specifically says what he wants. We need to be listening to that.
Yeah. That's a good point to make. A lot of times people today will say, well, it doesn't really matter what you do for worship, right? It doesn't really matter what you do for leadership, that God's just kind of happy if you do whatever it is that you want to do and heave that up to him, that God doesn't care about the details. Well, we see a God that cares about the details here, right? And especially when you get into Leviticus, right? There's repetition over and over and over again with regards to how they are to prepare those sacrifices, which part of that sacrifice belongs to the Lord, right? The fatty portions, the lobe next to the liver, right? All of that over and over again, he's going to say that's the Lord's portion, that belongs to him. So God's very specific, right? And God, there's a lot of detail. God's a God of detail. And God does care about the details when he says, here's what it is that I want you to do. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, and all of this, right? Not just with the manna, but they got to rely on God for it. They have to rely on God to get out of Egypt. They have to rely on God to get across the Red Sea. They had to rely on God for water. Now they've had to rely on God for food. We're going to see that they need to rely on God again for water another time here in chapter 17. Because they've moved away from where the water is, right? It says in chapter 17, verse 1, then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, why is it that you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Here's their same complaint again, right? That Moses has just brought them out into the wilderness in order to kill them. Oh, that we had it so much better in Egypt. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Well, if you remember back at the beginning of the book of Exodus, they were crying to the Lord, right? They were calling out to the Lord, asking to be delivered from the bondage that they were under. But they've got a short memory. They've got a short memory when it comes to just how bad things were in Egypt, that once they get out of there and they have to struggle a little bit in the wilderness and they've got to rely upon God for what it is that they need to have, that they complain and they moan when they get out there. And so they contend with Moses, and he says, why do you tempt the Lord? And so we got this contention and temptation, or tempting of the Lord that's here in the words that are used. And so why have you just brought us out here to kill us with thirst? Moses cried out to the Lord saying, what shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me. Right? When people get to where we're not going to take this anymore, they're getting ready to maybe stone Moses and do something else. This isn't the first time that they wanted to stone Moses, or that they were upset with Moses. It won't be the last time that they want to stone Moses either. When we get over to the book of Numbers and they send the spies, and the spies come back and they say, oh, we can't take the land. Right? There's giants in the land and the cities are fortified, and it's just going to be too hard. We can't do this. And Joshua and Caleb say, no, with the Lord we can do this. They wanted to pick up stones. They wanted to stone Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb. They wanted to stone them, elect a new leader, and go back to Egypt. Well, God doesn't want them to go back to Egypt, right? And so they're going to have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That's why they're going to eat manna in the wilderness for 40 years, because over and over and over again, it's not just because of the report of the spies. When that happens, God says, these 10 times you've rebelled against me. Well, this is part of that rebellion. This is one of those times that they're rebelling against God. And so God, it's not just, one time you mess up and okay, that's it. Or 2 times you mess up. God says, these 10 times, you have rebelled against me, and so now you're going to have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And so God's patient with them, but at some point God's patience wears out. God's patient with us. Right? The Lord's not slack concerning his promise, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, but is long-suffering towards us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. God suffers long, right? He's long-suffering. He's patient with us, gives us ample time to repent and to come to him. We wonder, with the way the world is and the things that are going on in the world, why doesn't Jesus just come back now, right, and end all of this? God's being patient. There's more people that can be saved. I think if there wasn't anybody left to be saved, God wouldn't let the world continue to spin, but there's more people out there that can be saved, and so there's a purpose to God's patience. Now, they cry out here, they're ready to stone Moses, In verse 5 of chapter 17, the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you a stone, or take with you some of the elders of Israel. Take in your hand your rod, which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And so, right, they were contending with the Lord, they were tempting the Lord, and so again, they name the place contention and temptation, right, or contention and rebellion. They name it Massah and Meribah. That's what those words mean. Literally, tempted and contention are what Massah and Meribah mean. Yes, sir?
The way Moses poses this question to God is kind of interesting. He says, "What shall I do with these people?" He's taken a lot of this responsibility on himself. As you see, it's kind of a character flaw of his, and that's what kind of gets him in trouble, is he takes that, and even his father-in-law points it out, like, you need help.
Yeah.
And you even see that even with the attitude of the disciples, fast forward in the New Testament with Jesus prior to the feeding of 5,000, like, what are we supposed to do? And Jesus tells them, like, feed them.
Yeah.
They kind of miss the point,
Yeah.
that it's not you, it's God.
Right.
It's that whole reliance on God.
Yeah, you can sort of see Moses' frustration from time to time, right? What shall I do with this people? Later on, Moses will say, "Did I sire all of these people? Am I the father? Why did you put me in charge of all these people? Did I create all of them? Am I their father? That I should have to take care of all of these people?" So there are times where Moses gets frustrated, but Moses continues to intervene for people that are complaining against him. He continues to pray for people that are complaining against, people that are ready to take up stones and stone him. But he's willing to pray for them and intervene for them and be an intermediary, right, with them, and going to the Lord and praying for them to not be destroyed. I think there's a lesson in there for us. Sometimes we're wronged by people, and I don't know, nobody's ever tried to pick up stones and stone me before, right? But we get offended by something that somebody does, or we get offended by something that somebody says. We're praying for those people? Or do we say, washing my hands of them, right? Moses was a great leader. Moses was a great person because he continues to intervene for these people. So even though they want to pick up stones and stone him, he goes to the Lord and says, "What do you want me to do? What am I to do with all these people?" Right? And so God tells him to go stand before the rock and to take his rod and to strike the rock, and the water is going to come forth. Now this probably isn't just a little trickle of water, right? This is probably opening up some sort of spring, because you got 603,550 men that are above the age of 20 that have come out of Egypt, right? And so you got all the women and children. So we're talking probably close to 2 million people that you got to find water for, plus livestock that you got to. That's a lot of water, right? That's a lot of water every day to take care of those folks. And so he strikes the rock and the water comes forth. And God told him to strike the rock. Now, later, Moses is going to be frustrated. He's going to be much older. He's going to be approximately 40 years older. And his sister Miriam has passed away, which we could imagine that would maybe create some additional stress upon him, that his older sister has passed away. And in Numbers chapter 20, God tells him to take his rod, but to go speak to the rock and bring forth water for the people on that particular occasion. And Moses instead strikes the rock twice. And he says, "Must we bring forth water for you?" On that occasion, Moses didn't treat God as being holy, right? Didn't give the glory to God. He said, "Must we bring forth water for you?" And didn't do what the Lord said in speaking to the rock, but struck the rock, right? Because of that, because Moses didn't treat God as holy in Numbers chapter 20, that's the reason why Moses isn't going to be allowed to go into the promised land when they cross over the Jordan. He's going to beg God to forgive him for that. And it's not that he bears any sort of, it's not that, well, we're not going to see Moses in heaven because he struck the rock. It's not that, right? But he's not going to get to go into the physical promised land because of what it is that he's done. How do we know that he's spiritually okay?
Transfiguration.
On the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah, right, are there speaking with Jesus. And so we know that Moses is in a good place, right? And so he's not going to bear any spiritual guilt for that, but sometimes there's physical punishment that comes, and the physical punishment is that he's not going to be the one to lead the children across into the land of Canaan, that Joshua was going to be the one who's going to do that. And Moses was allowed to see it from the top of Mount Nebo, but he wasn't allowed to go in. But here's the earlier incident where he is told to strike the rock. He strikes the rock and the water comes forth. And again, they're having to depend upon God for what it is that they need. They have to depend upon God for their protection. They have to depend upon God for their food, and they have to depend upon God for their water. And so the people were tempting God by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Well, how could you not know that God is with you, right? He's providing manna for you every morning, right? He's parted the Red Sea so that you could walk across on dry ground. He's destroyed the army of the Egyptians. How could you at that point doubt whether or not God is with you? But they do, right? Is the Lord among us or not? And that's what angers Moses and angers the Lord. Verse 8, it says, Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, and Moses said to Joshua, Choose us some men to go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. When he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. So you got this battle that takes place here. The Amalekites have come out, and they are basically attacking the rear ranks of the Israelites. They're attacking those that are straggling behind. Now, if you've got 2 million people and you're traveling, right, you're going to have folks that are maybe a little older. They're maybe a little weary. Maybe you've got children that are at the back. And so Amalek here is attacking their weakest ranks, right, attacking their weakest people at the rear of the guard. And we don't see it necessarily here, but over in Deuteronomy, God's going to tell Moses, you write this for memorial in the book. You write this down in the book. You tell the children of Israel to remember what it is that Amalek did, how he attacked your rear ranks when you came out of Egypt. He says, I'm going to blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. That God's going to blot these people out for what it is that they've done. I don't know that we can read that today and not think about what's going on. Right? The attack on the weakest members of society, those that are elderly and those that are children. The heinous thing that took place a week ago over in the Middle East, over in Israel, as far as what Hamas has done there. And I mean, we know that at this time, the Jews were God's chosen people, right? That he's leading them out of Egypt. He's going to choose them from all the nations to be the place where he's going to put his name, and they're going to be his chosen people. But that's not the case anymore. Once Christ comes, things change. And the Israel of today that God is concerned about is spiritual Israel. You read about that, especially in the book of Romans, that the Jews thought, well, I'm of the seed of Abraham and I've been circumcised on the 8th day. They thought because of that they had punched their ticket and they were on their way to heaven as God's chosen people. And Jesus says, no, that's not the case, right? God can raise up children to Abraham from these stones that are sitting here, right? You talked about that on Wednesday night, that just being a child of Abraham isn't enough. You got to be able to follow Jesus. Now, just because they're not God's chosen people anymore doesn't mean that we would condone violence in any sense, right, against folks. We're not to annihilate people like they're going to be told to annihilate the Amalekites, right? Because that's God's will. And God's going to say, this is what I want you to do. I want you to wipe these people out for what it is that they've done to you. God will take vengeance. I don't know where I was going with all of that. But God will take vengeance for them. I had some notes on my laptop, right, for this particular section to remind me of the places that I wanted to go. But God's going to take vengeance on them. And over in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul, who is king, is going to be told, I want you to go and I want you to utterly destroy the Amalekites, right? What does that mean? Utterly destroy. I want you to utterly destroy. God wants him to wipe out all of the Amalekites. right? Including all of their livestock and everything that they have, that you treat it all as what's considered Corban, right? You consider it all as stuff that belongs to God, that you don't take any of that. And so Saul goes and he fights against the Amalekites and he defeats the Amalekites, but he brings Agag, right, the king, back with him. And so he brings Agag with him, and they bring back the best of the animals, the best of the herds, because they didn't want to destroy those, because, boy, those are nice animals. I'd like to have those in my herd. I'd like to breed some of those, right? Because you breed good animals and you get good animals, right? And so they're unwilling to destroy the animals, and so they bring some of them back. And so Saul comes along, and Samuel comes to look for him, and he can't find Saul. Saul's gone and erected a monument to himself for the great thing that he's done, right? He's patting himself on the back. And when Samuel comes to Saul, Saul says, have you seen the great thing that I've done? And Samuel says, you haven't done what the Lord said. The Lord said, go destroy Amalek, utterly destroy, right? What part of utterly destroy is ambivalent, right, or ambiguous? It's not easy to be understood. He says, you were to go and utterly destroy them. And here, he says, well, we did utterly destroy them. Here's Agag, their king, right? And here's all these animals. And Samuel says, if you just did what the Lord did, what's this bleating of sheep that I hear in my ears? Right? You were supposed to destroy all those animals. And Saul never takes ownership of it, right? Never takes ownership of his own sin. He says, well, we did. I utterly destroyed them, but the people brought these animals out, right? And we're going to sacrifice them to God. That's what we're going to do with them. I talked about this in a sermon a while back about David, being a man after God's own heart, because he owned his sin and Saul never did. And so Saul was supposed to utterly destroy these folks because of what they did here in Exodus chapter 17. He's supposed to wipe all of them out. He's not supposed to bring Agag back so he could be some sort of trophy king that he could sit at his feast table and tell others, hey, remember the Amalekites? There's their king over there. I slew the people. I whipped them, He's not to do that. And they weren't to bring any of those animals back either. And so to keep just part of the commandment on Saul's part wasn't good enough. He was supposed to keep the whole commandment of the Lord. And so these Amalekites attack. Now, notice in the battle that Joshua chooses some men and they go down and they fight. So they do have, a fighting force at this point. Not, again, they're shepherds, right? And they're farmers. Usually, people like A&M, they're not real hard to beat, right? But because they're just farmers. But sometimes they can be a little more difficult. So, especially if they're from Texas. So they take their fighting force and they go down there in the field. We might think, well, these are the heroes, right? These are the guys that are going down and they're going to fight against the Amalekites. And, well, what's Moses doing? Well, he's just sitting up on the top of the hill with his arms in the air, right? And Hur goes up there with them, and Aaron goes up there with them. And we might think, well, their role seems to be fairly insignificant, right, from a worldly perspective, that the battle's down here and you're sitting up on the mountain with your arms in the air. But they had the most important position that day, didn't they? As long as Moses was able to hold up his arms, they were able to win, and Hur and Aaron helped him to hold up his hands. We all have different roles in the Lord's church. Everybody's role is important. And there's maybe no more important role than holding up the hands of the eldership to help them, right, and to strengthen them, because they've got a tough job. Usually people don't come to the elder and say, boy, you guys are really doing a great job here. I love what you're doing. Right? Usually it's complaints that elders get, by and large. The people come and they complain to an elder. The temperature in the room was 2 degrees too hot, or it was 2 degrees too cold, or I can't believe we had the fans on. I was chilled the whole time. Or why aren't we passing the trays, for the Lord's Supper? All sorts of things people want to complain about, right? They had an important position, and they had maybe the most important position. And so we as people, right, in the church, we need to obey those who have the rule over us. We need to make it easier for them to do that job rather than more difficult, because it's already a difficult job. Comments or questions on these things? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
What that is, it's leadership
Yeah, no one, you're right. No one person could do it by themselves, no matter what ministry people are involved in. It's all important, right? It's all important to the whole body as far as what it is that we're doing. And we're going to get that no one man can do it himself, because that's what Moses' father-in-law is about to see in chapter 18. That Moses is trying to take too much on himself. He's trying to do too much by himself, and that's not going to work. So Moses' hands became heavy. They helped hold his hands up, and Joshua defeated Amalek and the people with the edge of the sword in verse 13. Verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book, recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And the Lord built an altar and called its name, the Lord is my banner. For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. And so God says, write this down. We're going to, at some point, blot out the remembrance of Amalek. Now, Saul is told to go do it, but he doesn't do it completely, because David is going to have to fight against Amalekites later on. So there are still Amalekites that are left. But at some point, God is going to wipe them out from under the face of their family is no longer going to continue at a certain point. That God is going to wipe out the remembrance of them from under heaven. And so he tells Moses to write this in the book. So we see Moses is writing things down. So when folks say, well, this, what we have as far as the Pentateuch comes from other places, it comes from, oral tradition that people wrote down much later. Moses is told to write this stuff down. And so Moses is writing it someplace. And Moses is writing it for us to have today, so that we can know what it is that God did, how God interacted with his people, and what God expected from them. And it gives us an idea of God's personality and what God would expect from us, right? The principles that are here. In chapter 18, Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, with her 2 sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, I've been a stranger in a foreign land. And the name of the other was Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. So they get to this encampment, right? They get out to the place where we're getting now to where we are. The children of Israel are here at Mount Sinai, or they're very close to Mount Sinai. And so Jethro, or Reuel as he's sometimes referred to, who is Moses' father-in-law, comes out and meets him. Now, at some point, it doesn't tell us where in the text, but at some point, you remember when Moses left the land of Midian to go into Egypt to bring his people out, he took Zipporah, his wife, and he took Gershom, right? And in chapter 4, there was a question about the son being circumcised, needed to be circumcised, or else God was going to kill him. And so he took them with him into Egypt. But at some point, they went back home, because the text tells us here that Jethro is bringing Zipporah and Moses' sons along with him. So at some point, they must have left Egypt and gone back to Midian, and now they're being reunited with Moses once again, right? Because sometimes you have to make those assumptions. Right? If it says somebody came out of Egypt, well, it would mean that somebody had to go into Egypt, right? Even if it doesn't tell us that they went into Egypt. Can't come out of Egypt if you never went in, right? Just like when the Bible says, listen to what it is that Jesus has to say, give a more earnest heed to the things that Jesus has said, lest we drift away, right? You can't drift away from some place that you've never been either. Right? You have to have been somewhere in order to be able to drift away from it. So they're reunited. He brings them back with him. It says that they were encamped at the mountain of God. Now he had said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, kissed him, and they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. And notice here in verse 11, he says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. So Moses tells Jethro, here's what happened. Here's what happened in Egypt. Tells him about the plagues, right? Tells him about them being delivered from Egypt and all the things that God has done, and how God has not just defeated the Egyptians, and he hasn't just defeated Pharaoh, but as we saw several weeks ago, when you look over in Numbers chapter 33, it talks about how God had executed judgment and had defeated all of those Egyptian gods. And when we went through the plagues, it's on the videos for those of you that weren't here. But it's when we went through the plagues, we showed how that was a defeat of all these different Egyptian gods, each one of these individual plagues that took place, right? And so when he relays all this to Jethro, now it's not that Jethro, right? Jethro or Ruel, he's a priest of God in Midian, right? And so he's a priest of God. He believes in God. He knows that God is God. Right? He doesn't have any confusion about that. But when he says here, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, well, what he means by that is there's some proof of this, right? He's got some better knowledge of it. If you look at this in the original, in the Hebrew, right, there's different words that are used there for knowledge. But if you look at it in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which is sometimes abbreviated LXX because there were 70 people that worked on that translation. But there was a Greek translation that was done of the Old Testament. And in the Greek translation, the word that is used here for know is a Greek word that means experiential knowledge. You basically have two words in Greek for knowledge. One is book knowledge, right? I can read something and I understand what I read and I know what it is that I've read, and so I've got some book knowledge, right? Peyton Manning played for the University of Tennessee, right? He broke some records in the NFL with regards to passing touchdowns. Was it 55 in one season? He threw 55 touchdown passes in one season. And so he said so I've got some book knowledge, right, about Peyton Manning. I can read those things and I can understand that. That's not the word that Jethro uses here, right? The word that he uses here when he says, now I know, he's talking about experiential knowledge, right? I can know that the stovetop is hot, right? That burner is turned on. I can look at the dial and I can know, right? I can have book knowledge that stovetop is on. But if I set my hand on there, now I know that stovetop is hot, right? That's a different kind of knowledge. And as a child, right, when you tell a child, don't touch that, it's hot, the child knows that they're not supposed to touch that. But do you think that they've got a different memory in their mind when they touch that stovetop versus you just telling them? Right? It means more when you've got some. So Jethro is not saying, I didn't know before that God was greater than all these other gods. What he's saying is that now I know, right? Now I know more fully. Now I know more completely. Now I've got that experiential knowledge, right, that the Lord is greater than all the gods. For in all this thing they behaved proudly, he was above them. Well, who was it that behaved proudly? It was Pharaoh, right? It was Pharaoh's reliance upon the Egyptian gods and Pharaoh's reliance upon himself, Pharaoh's stubbornness, right, that he behaved very proudly in the way that he hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go. And so Jethro rejoices for the good that the Lord has done for Israel. It says, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So when Moses' father-in-law saw what he did for the people, he said, What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me. I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you are not able to perform it by yourself. So Jethro doesn't just offer advice. Right? He doesn't, you've been gone from me for a while. You went into Egypt. You brought your people Israel out. You've told me all the things that have happened to you and how God has protected you. Now let me give you some advice. Right? Jethro watches to see what's going on first. He observes before he speaks. And so he observes Moses sitting before the people all day, and the people standing before him, and they're bringing their cases. And Jethro says, this isn't good. Both you and the people that are with you are going to wear yourselves out. right? Because Moses, you have to make all of these judgments. You have to do all this by yourself. You can't do it alone, right? You're going to wear yourself out. And the people are having to stand all day because there's just one judge. Imagine that you're going to go to traffic court, right? And there's one traffic court in the United States. You got to go wait in line. That would wear you out, wouldn't it? It'd be like being at the DMV. Luckily, the DMV, they got several people. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but they got several people behind the counter to help us. But you're going to wear the people out if they have to stand and they have to wait all day, and you're going to wear yourself out. And the thing that you're doing isn't good. You can't do it all by yourself. And we'll pick up here next week and we'll see what Jethro's advice is. But we can't do it all ourselves either. One person can't do everything. We have to be all in this together. Thank you for your attention and for your